Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. President Hoover's conservative response to the Great Depression drew a lot of criticism from Americans. Worsening conditions in the country caused the government to become more involved in health and the wealth of the people, and that story is our subject for today in episode 2 of Hoover's response. So, dear students, incline your ear and hear our stories that you might find your place among his delights. We have 5 objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to describe how people struggled to survive during the Great Depression. You should be able to explain how the Great Depression affected men, women, and children. You should be able to explain Hoover's initial response to the Depression, summarize actions Hoover took to help the economy and the hardships suffered by Americans. You should also be able to describe the bonus army and Hoover's actions towards it. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 4. Here we're going to talk about life just in general during the Great Depression. And let's start with the discussion as it affected the urban areas and the cities. In cities across the country, people were losing their jobs. They were evicted from their homes and they ended up in the streets. Some people slept in parks or sewer pipes and they wrapped themselves in newspapers to fend off the cold. Others built makeshift shacks out of scrap materials. Before long, there was all these shanty towns, little towns like consisting of little shacks that sprang up. And every day the poor dug through garbage cans or begged. Soup kitchens were offering free or low-cost food or bread lines. Where people could go get handouts of meals. The lines of people waiting received food provided by charitable organizations or public agencies. They became a common sight. African-American unemployment rates were higher than the overall public, and they were the lowest paid also. Black people dealt with increasing racial violence from unemployed white people competing for the same jobs. Latinos, mainly Mexicans and Mexican-Americans living in the Southwest, were also targets. Whites demanded that Latinos be deported or expelled from the country, even though a lot of them had been born in America already. By the late 1930s, hundreds of thousands of people of Mexican descent were relocating to Mexico. Set point B. Let's focus to see how the Depression is being handled in rural areas as well. Life in rural areas was hard. It did have one advantage over rural areas, and that was that farmers could grow food. But with falling prices and rising debt, thousands of farmers lost their land in ways of just getting the farms repossessed by the bank. Between 1929 and 1932, there was about 400,000 farms lost through foreclosure. That's hard to say. Foreclosure is the process by which a mortgage holder, like a bank, takes control of the property. They take it back if the occupant hasn't made payments. So, like if a bank has a mortgage on a farm and the farmer doesn't pay the bill on the house they bought or the farm they bought, then the bank will eventually say, hey, you're not paying for this, we're going to go take it back. A lot of farmers turn to tenant farming. Tenant farming is where they don't own the land. They work for somebody else. They live on the property and barely scraped out a living. Tenant farming is a model of agriculture, but it's a pretty hard model of agriculture, subpoint C. In the 1930s, there was also a drought. Kind of the climatological conditions sweeping across the country were in bad shape, and the drought began in the early 1930s, and it wreaked havoc on the Great Plains. During the previous decade, farmers from Texas to North Carolina had been using trackers to go break up the grassland and go plant millions of acres of new farmland, plowing and remove the thick protective layer of prairie grasses which had held the soil into place. And then farmers exhausted the land through overproduction of crops, and the grasslands eventually became unsuitable for farming. When the drought and the winds began in the early 1930s, what little grass and few trees that were there just wasn't much to hold down in the soil, and basically the nutritive topsoil of the land just kind of blew away. And wind scattered the topsoil, exposing the sand and grit underneath, and the soil underneath the topsoil was really not very good for farming. The dust of the blowing away soil traveled to hundreds of miles. One windstorm in 1934 blew millions of tons of dust from the plains to East Coast cities. The region that was hardest to hit included parts of Kansas and Oklahoma and Texas and New Mexico and Colorado. It became known collectively as the area known as the Dust Bowl. Plagued by dust storms and evictions, thousands of farmers and sharecroppers just left. They just left their land behind and tried to go elsewhere. They packed up the families and a few belongings, and they headed west, following Route 66 to California. Some of these migrants became known as Okies. Now, originally, Okies were specifically people from Oklahoma, but over time, kind of everybody was grouped as an Okie. They found work as farmhands in the West, and others continued to wander in search of other work. By the end of the 1930s, hundreds of thousands of farm families had migrated to California and other Pacific Coast cities. Roman numeral number 5. A lot of men, in particular, had difficulty of coping with unemployment because they were accustomed to working and supporting their families. But when the Depression hit, they basically lost the ability to go do that. Some abandoned their families altogether. And during the Depression, as many as 300,000 transient people, the hobos, they wandered the country, hitching rides on railroad boxcars and sleeping under bridges. These hobos of the 1930s were mainly men, and they would occasionally turn up at homeless shelters in big cities. During the early years of the Great Depression, there was no federal system of direct relief. There was no cash payments or food provided by the government to the poor. Some cities and some charity services tried to help, but the benefits were pretty meager. Subpoint B, a lot of women worked to go help their families survive adversity during the Great Depression. Many canned food and sewed clothes just to get along there. So women also were often carefully managing the household budgets. A lot of women did work outside the home, although they usually received less money than men did who were in similar positions. As the Depression wore on, though, a lot of working women became the targets of enormous resentment. A lot of people believed that women, especially married women, had no right to work when they were men who were similarly unemployed. As early as the 1930s, some cities refused to hire any women, any married women, as things like school teachers. Many Americans assumed that women were having an easier time than men were because they saw very few women begging or standing in bread lines. That may be unfair. I mean, you can't really judge the health of an economy based on who's standing in the bread lines. If the men are, bringing home the bread for their families, it doesn't mean that, women aren't having a hard time either. Subpoint C. Let's focus also on how children were affected during the Great Depression, because poor diets and a lack of money for healthcare led to real serious health problems for a lot of children. We saw a sharp decline in milk consumption because you got to go buy milk, and clinics and hospitals reported a dramatic rise in malnutrition and any diet-related diseases, things like rickets. At the same time, child welfare programs are being slashed in cities and states as they cut their budgets in the face of dwindling resources. Falling tax revenues were also calling school boards to go shorten the school year. Take in 1933, there was around 2,600 schools across the nation that just ran out of money and shut down. They left more than 300,000 students out of school, and thousands of children went to work into sweatshops, and they were laboring in bad conditions. A lot of teenagers looked for a way out of the suffering, and hundreds of thousands of teenage boys and girls hopped aboard America's freight trains to go zigzag the country in search of work and adventure and escape from the poverty. They were known as the Wild Boys, and they came from every section of the United States and every society. They were the sons of poor farmers and out-of-work miners and wealthy parents who ended up losing everything. Sometimes they referred to themselves as Hoover tourists, and they were eager to go out and wander America. While this was exciting, the road could also be pretty deadly. It's a dangerous thing to go out and, wandering. A lot of riders were beaten or jailed by bulls. Bulls were these armed freight yard patrolmen, basically had to go keep them out of the trains. Other riders had to go sleep on standing up and, in a constant deafening rumble. And freight cars are not passenger freights. It's not a good way to travel. Others were accidentally locked in things like ice cars and for days on end, and others fell prey to murderous criminals. From 1929 to 1939, that decade, of the Great Depression, tens of thousands were killed or injured on railroad property, and that's a pretty dangerous way to live life. Subpoint D. The hardships of the Great Depression also had a tremendous social and psychological impact, but some people were so demoralized by the hard times that they, frankly, just lost their will to survive. Between 1929 and 1932, the suicide rate rose by more than 30%, and 3 times as many people were admitted to state mental hospitals as they were in normal times. The economic problems forced Americans to accept compromises and make sacrifices that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Adults stopped going to the doctor or the dentist because they just plain old couldn't afford it. Young people gave up their dreams of going to college. Others put off getting married and raising large families or having children at all. During the Depression, a lot of people showed also great kindness to strangers who were down on their luck. People often gave food and clothing and a place to stay to the needy. Families helped others and shared resources, and there was a sense of a strengthened bond in the community, as feeling that people are all in it together. Also, people developed habits of saving and thriftiness, habits they would need to see themselves through the dark days ahead, as the nation and President Hoover were out struggling with the Great Depression. These habits shaped a whole generation of Americans, and there's this era of Americans, people that survived the Great Depression. It changed them. It fundamentally changed them. Roman numeral number 6. Hoover tried to reassure the nation, and with mixed success. And a lot of the things maybe could point to some good news, maybe the boom and bust cycle. Because after the stock market crash in October of 1929, President Herbert Hoover tried to reassure Americans that the nation's economy was really on sound footing. He said, any lack of confidence in the economic future is foolish, he declared. In this view, the important thing for Americans were just to remain optimistic and to go about their business as usual. Americans believed that depressions were just kind of a natural part of the business cycle. Sometimes you boom and sometimes you bust. And there were these periods of rapid economic growth followed by periods of depression. And a basic understanding of economic history seemed to prove that out. The best course in a slump, according to the experts who hold this point of view, was to do nothing and let the economy fix itself. Now, Hoover took a slightly different position because that's some pretty hard medicine. He felt that the government could play a limited role in helping to solve problems. They believe the government could play a limited role in helping to solve problems. And that takes us to subpoint B, what's Hoover's philosophy? Herbert Hoover had been an engineer. He'd put great faith in the power of reason, but he was also a humanitarian. He wasn't like some cold robotic guy. You remember that Hoover is the guy that led the huge human relief programs after World War I. And like a lot of Americans, Hoover believed that government should foster cooperation between competing groups and interests in society. If business and labor were in a conflict, he said, government should step up and help them find a solution if it served the mutual interest of both people. But he said this cooperation had to be voluntary rather than forced. Government's role was to encourage and facilitate cooperation, not to force people into it. On the other hand, Americans also valued a position known as rugged individualism. Rugged individualism was the idea that people should succeed more or less through their own efforts. They should take care of themselves and their families rather than depend on the government to go bail them out of trouble. And therefore, Hoover opposed any kind of federal welfare for society. He wasn't going to give government handouts to go help the needy. He thought that handouts would weaken people's self-respect and basically just kind of make them soft and weaken their moral fiber. Instead, he thought that really the care for the poor needed to be handled through individuals and charities and local organizations. They're the ones that should go pitch in to care for the less fortunate, not government handouts along the way. Subpoint C. Hoover's political philosophy caused him to take a pretty cautious approach into the Depression. Soon after the stock market, though, he called together key leaders in the fields of business and banking and labor along the way and urged them to go work together to go find solutions to their economic woes. He asked employers not to cut wages or to lay off workers. He basically said, hey, businesses, I know you're on hard times, but find a way to not fire people or not lay them off along the way. He asked labor leaders, said, hey, listen, businesses are having a hard time. This isn't a good time to go on strike or demand higher wages. He created a special organization to go help private charities, to go raise contributions, to go help the poor. But none of these things ultimately made much of a difference. A year after the crash, the economy was still shrinking and unemployment was still rising. Subpoint D. One of the projects that Hoover did do to try to make a difference was well, now we call it the Hoover Dam. It was then called the Boulder Dam. Years earlier, when Hoover was Secretary of Commerce under the Harding administration and then later the Coolidge administration, it was one of his earliest proposed initiatives to construct a dam on the Colorado River. To go minimize federal intervention, Hoover proposed to pay for the dam's construction by selling the electric power that would generate. Basically, he says, go build a dam on the Colorado River, and that's going to create construction jobs. And then the dam would be also, you put a turbine in it and we go and create electricity, and then the electricity has value, like people go pay their utility bills. In this case, we'll go sell electricity from there. Also, you start storing up water in the dam, and then that can be used for irrigation purposes to go get the farms of the West more evened out. So Hoover this was like his big master plan, the Boulder Dam. To minimize federal intervention, Hoover proposed to pay for the dam's construction, basically saying the electricity that it'll generate will go pay for the dam itself. He arranged for water rights along the Colorado River in Arizona and Colorado and California and Nevada, New Mexico, and Utah and Wyoming. By the time this was a massive undertaking, and by the time it got congressional approval in 1928, it was a $700 million public works program, it was by that point, Hoover had been elected to the White House. He started when he was working in a cabinet department. By the time it actually passed, he's a president. By the fall of 1929, a year into his presidency, Hoover was finally able to authorize construction of the Boulder Dam. Today we know it as the Hoover Dam. It was 726. I guess it's still there. So it's still 726 feet high. Over 1,200 feet long. It was at the time the world's largest dam and the second largest. It was the world's tallest dam and the second largest overall. It provided electricity and flood control, but it also provided a steady water supply to California's massive agricultural economy. It still exists today, and it still provides water for Los Angeles and Las Vegas. It's outside Las Vegas. It's the subject of one of the scenes of the kind of the worst of the National Lampoon's movies, the one Vegas Vacation, but it's kind of the subplot of that movie because it's a real place, and I hear it's a cool tourist attraction. Subpoint E. As Americans grew more and more frustrated by the Depression, they expressed their anger in a lot of different ways. Farmers stung by low crop prices ended up burning their corn and wheat, and they dumped milk on highways rather than go sell it at a loss. Basically, farmers said, we're producing all of this stuff, and you take it to a market and we end up losing money on it. So why do we even take it to the market? Won't flood the market. Let's create some artificial shortages and destroy the food before it ever gets there. So they started pouring out the milk along the highway rather than go sell it at a loss, and go burn their cornfields down. Even though the corn is ready and could be sold, they said, if I go sell it, I lose money on it. So let's just torch it and not lose the money. Other farmers declared what they called a farm holiday, and they said, we're just not going to go to work. There's kind of nothing in it for us to go to work. Some blocked the roads to keep food from reaching the market, hoping that food shortages would go raise the prices for it. Some farmers even used force to go prevent authorities from foreclosing. Along the way, all of these things are kind of a slap in the face to people in urban areas who said, we can't get food. We can't afford it. And now, farmers, shows a real imbalance in the market, that farmers can't make any money selling food, but people can't buy any food because it's not making it in the market as well. Something is systematically wrong in the way that food was reaching people in the 1930s. By 1930, people were calling these shanty towns in American City, the ones that we talked about earlier in this episode. The shanty towns were in American cities were called Hoovervilles. It was a kind of a shot at Americans' policies. Homeless people called the newspapers they wrapped themselves in Hoover blankets, and empty pockets turning inside out to go show they didn't have any money in them. Those were called Hoover flags. And a lot of Americans that a generation earlier, even really just a few years earlier, thought that Hoover was a great humanitarian and a genius who could solve all the problems. They now saw him as a cold and heartless leader. And that brings us to Roman numeral number 7, where Hoover takes action. Hoover tried to go back cooperatives along the way to go try to make some effort to go solve the Great Depression. As time went on, the Depression deepened. Hoover gradually softened his position on government intervention in the economy, and he took more of an activist approach on the nation's economic troubles. He backed the creation of the Federal Farm Board. The Federal Farm Board was an organization of farm cooperatives that intended to raise crop prices by helping members buy crops and keep them off the market temporarily until prices rose. In addition, Hoover tried to prop up the banking system by persuading the nation's largest bank to go establish the National Credit Corporation. This was an organization that loaned money to smaller banks and tried to help them stave off bankruptcy. Subpoint B. By late 1931, these measures weren't working. They didn't fix the economy. Hoover was trying to do stuff, but it didn't appear to be doing anything substantial to go fix the problem. And with the presidential election looming, Hoover's like, hey, listen, people need to see that I'm trying to work hard here. And so he appealed to Congress to go reform banking and go provide mortgage relief and to funnel more federal money into business investment. In 1932, Hoover signed into law the Federal Home Loan Bank Act, which lowered mortgage rates for homeowners and allowed farmers to refinance loans to go avoid foreclosure. By the time Hoover had left office, Congress had also passed a proposal that Hoover had championed, the Glass-Steagall Banking Act, which separated investment from commercial banking in hopes to prevent another crash. Basically, it tried to get banks into traditional banking roles and less in investment roles, and make it so banks weren't so risky along the way. Hoover's most ambitious measure was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. It was approved by Congress in 1932. It authorized up to $2 billion for emergency financing for banks banks and life insurance companies and railroads and other large businesses to try to go shore up these huge industries in America. Hoover believed that the money would go then trickle down to the average citizen through job growth and higher wages. And, if the railroads can get propped up and keep going, then they'll keep employing people. But if the railroads go to business, then that's even worse. So basically, it's the too big to fail model, and he wanted to keep them going. But a lot of critics really criticized this approach. They argued that the program was benefiting corporations and not the poor. And the poor are the ones that needed direct relief, not big business. Hungry people, they said, couldn't wait for the benefits to go trickle down to them along the way. And maybe in the long run that works, but in the short run, people are hungry. In his first 5 months of operation, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation loaned $805 million to large corporation, but it just didn't seem to be enough. Business failures continue. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation was an unprecedented example of federal involvement in the peacetime economy, but in the end, it was really too little, too late. Roman numeral number 8. We take probably what's one of the things that really slammed the door on the Hoover administration, and it's known as the bonus army. Subpoint A. In 1924, Congress had approved a bonus payment to veterans of World War I, of the Great War, payable by 1945, 27 years after it ended. Basically, people who served in the Great War, by the time they were retirement age, they would get a bonus payout, something like a pension along the way, paid out in the form of cash and a life insurance policy. But the bad economy, by the time it hit the 1920s, the bad economy meant that veterans were desperate now, and they may not even make it to 1945 when they could go get the payout. And so the spring of 1932, it's hard to say how many, 10 to 20,000 World War I veterans and their families, they all marched on Washington to go demand an early payout of the bonus. They said, we need the payout now. And they called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force, or the Bonus Army. And it was kind of a takeoff the old American Expeditionary Force, which was the name of the American Army in Europe at the time. So this was the Bonus Expeditionary Force. Congressman Wright Passman of Texas introduced a bill basically authorizing the government to go pay out the bonus to World War I veterans for their service. Basically says, this is a congressman saying, hey, let's write a bill and go get them to pay out now. Walter Waters was an unemployed cannery worker from Oregon, and the bonus army, he led them along the way, and they came to the Capitol to go support this Patman bill. Hoover was suspicious of these protesters and basically says, so these are people marching on Washington, and they're demanding a government payment. He says, that sounds like communism, and he basically says these are communists and persons with criminal records along the way. He was very suspicious of people coming rather than veterans. He says, no, these are actors coming out to go, demand payouts to the government. He said, they have the right to go assemble peaceable, but he says, we're not going to go pay them out anything. He said, hey, you guys set up a shanty town. I'm going to do my best to provide you food and supplies because I can see you're hungry. And they set up their camps within sight of the Capitol along the way. On June 17th, though, the Senate voted down the Patman bill. It was unsuccessful. It failed. And then Hoover said, hey, you guys came for your peaceable assembly. It didn't work out. It's time for you to go home. And he called on the bonus army to leave. And most did. Most did. Having seen defeat in the halls of Congress, they said, welp, and they left. But approximately 2,000 of them stayed. And they hoped to urge Congress on to further legislative action or to get the president themselves to go take action. Hoover said, basically said, you got to go. And Hoover wanted to push them out. And so he called in federal troops. He basically called in the army to go push out the bonus army and get rid of these veterans along the way. And he sent in Army General Douglas MacArthur to go peaceably restrain and disperse the protests. MacArthur, subpoint B, MacArthur exceeded his orders. And what's kind of a classic MacArthur move, we'll talk more about him later, but he exceeded his orders and used violence. General Douglas MacArthur commanded an infantry regiment. And Major George Patton led a cavalry regiment and 6 battle tanks to go monitor the bonus army protests. The bonus marchers, believing that they're veterans. They see the Army coming in. They're seeing, infantry and cavalry and tanks coming along the way. And these veterans are like, hey, they're coming in to come support us, marching in their honor. And they cheered the troops until Patton would, again, kind of a classic Patton move here, order the cavalry to go charge in on the veterans, an action which prompted the spectators to yell like, shame, what are you doing? You're using the Army to go turn on Army veterans. The cavalry charged, and then the infantry dropped bayonets, and then shot tear gas into bonus Army camps, and they're trying to evict the veterans along the way, and families and camp followers. And President Hoover's like, whoa, I didn't order like bayonets and charging into the camp. I want them evicted. I don't want them attacked. He ordered the assault to stop, but MacArthur just chose to ignore the president, and he ordered a new attack. He claiming that the bonus march was an attempt to go overthrow the U.S. government. In the course of the operation, the infantry gassed 1,000 people. There was like families that were encamped along the way. A baby died in a hospital after a tear gas attack. There was an investigation saying that he died in enteritis, but a hospital spokesman said the tear gas probably aggravated the case of it. There was an 8-year-old boy who ended up being partially blinded from the attack as well. Like I said, there was families in the camp. 2 people were shot. There was a whole bunch of people that were injured. Most Americans were stunned and outraged at the government's treatment of the veterans. Once again, Hoover's like image suffered in this, and now an election was nearing. In November, Hoover would face a formidable opponent, a Democrat named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt heard about the attack, then he kind of quipped, and he says, "Well, this is what's going to elect me." The downturn in the economy and Hoover's inability to go deal effectively with the Depression sealed his political fate, and that's going to take us like to the eve of the election. And it's a fascinating story, and I can't wait to tell you about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.